Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats and this is Cheater's Gonna Cheat. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so we're going to start this one off with the tale of Sturla Ellingvag, the DNA researcher who believes he's the subject of a smear campaign because he criticized the way the findings of a study he participated in were disseminated to the media. This study here, Population Genomics of the Viking World. And this was a 6-year study led by one S.K. Villerslev. And here he is. Right, he's a Danish evolutionary geneticist, notable for his pioneering work in molecular anthropology, paleontology, and ecology. Right, and he believes that this study that he was the lead on shatters the familiar notions of blonde Vikings. But Sturla and one other researcher on that project, a researcher named Per Hulk, right, and here he is, and he's a Norwegian doctor and professor of anatomy with biological anthropology and forensic anthropology, and who knows how many ologies follow this guy around. But he and Sturla are not too happy with the way SK has been promoting, right, the findings of this study, right, which has been used as the springboard to get rid of the Vikings. Because SK is trumpeting that this study all but eliminates the idea of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed race of Vikings, while Sturla and Hulk say, not so fast. They say that no data had been used from the areas in Norway where Vikings primarily came from. To which SK responds that he believes that Ellingvag's interpretation of the research was one of many hypotheses on which there was no agreement in the research group, which we know isn't entirely true already, but I guess because he disagrees with the majority, his argument has no merit. That's what I'm picking up here. He says that he believes that Ellingvag's presentation of the research was completely in line with what white supremacists want to hear. And he goes on to say that therefore, one asks oneself, what is actually driving this? White supremacists want the Vikings to be genetically pure Scandinavians. That is well known, said Villerslev, who also believed that Ellingvag was scientifically dishonest and politically tendacious when he came out as he did against the findings in the article he co-authored. So he's essentially laying it out that Ellingvag is a white supremacist trying to keep the idea of a fair-haired super race of white Vikings alive for these idiots. But Sturla refutes this by saying that Villerslev's claims that I criticized the research that I myself had taken part in, but what I criticized was his dealings with the journalists and the way he talked about the findings in order to get coverage on CNN. I also criticized his statement about the Vikings' hair color, which was a pointed angle and unnecessary. So he's saying that he's not criticizing the research, he's criticizing SK's ego because the study wasn't about hair color. And while SK's claims aren't entirely baseless, from everything I've read, Sturla's personal politics do appear to be conservative because he had written for and been interviewed by conservative outlets when he was younger, some of which have now jumped the shark to the far-right agenda, after he left. And for his part, Sturla says that if those outlets had presented themselves that way back then, he would never have been associated with them. So you can make of that what you will, right? But in this guilt by association world in which we live today, Sturla must be a racist, right? It just has to be, right? And this accusation is very interesting coming from S.K. Villerslev, because S.K. has also been accused of being a racist, right? And this is a hyperlink to this webpage here. And this is a webpage called Berlinsk. And the article's title is S.K. Villerslev accused of racism. Everything has become so sensitive and extreme is his lead-off quote. And it says that S.K. Villerslev wants to put an end to racism at universities, but he himself has been accused of both racial treason and racist teaching. Racial treason. It's unbelievable. Right? Today, many researchers no longer dare to speak freely for fear of politicized students. Debate interview about race, death threats, and an insanely worrying development in the academic world. And so what this page is, where I pulled this, is just an index of articles from Berlinsk. And so I could not find the rest of this article. Not on Berlinsk, not on the gatekeeper search engines. It's as if this article has been scrubbed. Right? And I'm not saying that that's the case, but I just can't find it, right? And I would love to read this article because I think this is a very important part of the powers that be strategy. make certain ideas so powerful you become afraid to disagree with them. And the most interesting thing about this article may be that they give me a date on it, December 19th, 2020, because this is a full year, a little over a year, before this Chrono article about Sturla, which was published on January 18th, 2022. So I guess Eske has a short memory for getting the sting of being called a racist so quickly and completely that within the year, he's using the word against Sturla. And it's weirdness like this, and the notion that they were taking Viking DNA samples from as late as 500 years after the Viking Age, right? Human remains dated from between 2400 BC to 1600 AD, and which were buried with a variety of Viking artifacts. And it makes me wonder, what type of Viking artifacts were they pulling from 16 AD, 500 years after the Viking Age? It's this type of stuff, coupled with the bias of Mud City that our historians mislead us, that makes me think that the cancellation of Sturla is punishment for his whistleblowing, right? That they weren't using DNA from the parts of Norway where Vikings primarily came from. And that Eske is just playing his part, doing what he's told with these allegations. And of course, coming in at this from the direction that I did, Rollo being the forefather of the British royal family, makes me think that maybe they're, what's going on with this thing? Maybe they're trying to hide something, right? Because if Sturla says that they didn't use DNA from the areas in Norway where the Vikings primarily came from, well, then where did they come from? And were those people, the people from Norway where they didn't take this DNA samples from, were they these people? Because with so much of this seeming to be about erasing these people's connection to the Vikings, suggesting that a fellow like this is a fantasy, and filtering that through the prism of identity politics, this is reading like more than just an attack on these idiots, right? It's reading more like a cultural genocide of any fair-haired Scandinavian family that happened to buy in to the lie they've been sold. How fair is that, right? Because these idiots exist, and they upset the other fragile fractals, of which these idiots, of course, are just a part of, right? It's because of them that an entire ethnic group has to lose their heritage and parts of their national identity. That hardly seems fair, but that appears to be what's happening with all of this. Or it's a byproduct of this anyway, intentional or not, right? And the question I have is, what does any cultural appropriation these idiots may use for themselves have to do with whether or not there were blonde-haired and blue-eyed Vikings? Because unless the whole story of the Vikings coming from Scandinavia is false, there were blonde-haired and blue-eyed Vikings. What purpose does eliminating them from history serve other than hurting these idiots, right? And by extension, these people, right? And this may seem like an extreme comparison, but blaming or hurting these people because of these idiots seems an awful lot like blaming these people for these idiots, which is an idea that would get you canceled in a second. And so what's going on here with this story? Were the first Vikings a fair-haired, white-skinned people whose features were just diluted by the local variations of the people they either conquered or traded with? Or were there never any or just very few blonde-haired, blue-eyed Vikings in the first place? And either way, none of that should matter against these idiots, who are nothing more than pawns in this game. And this is a game we're all playing, whether we like it or not, right? So our controllers have made sure of that. And before we get into what the narrative tells us about the Vikings and those responsible for the lies that created these idiots, I want to take a look at two recent stories that illustrate how progress is kept in check, that to me perfectly demonstrate how some of, if not all of the issues that plague the fragile fractals, right? And this is all of us, by the way. Some of us are just a little more fragile than others, is the way I like to look at it. But these stories that I'm about to share are recent stories that show how our controllers manipulate the political stage for consumption by the masses. Because that's all we're here to do, right? All we're here to do is to consume. Whether it's food and drink or politics, sports, television, movies, what have you. Once you've created all of these hungry little mouths to feed and given them various appetites that have been fostered for generations, you need to sustain that, right? You need to give them sustenance, right? Because what you've done is you've created little identity politics junkies, and it's best to keep them in a constant state of agitation. You need to keep everyone so annoyed and distracted that they don't notice that the dope you're giving them is bunk, right? And you do this by telling them that all the bad in their lives, all the isms and phobias we fragile fractals either fear or hate, are systemic, right? They're part of someone else's broken system. By fractaling the human condition into so many different systems and poisoning them individually, it makes it easy to lose sight of the fact that there's only one system, the human system. And this poisoning of isms and phobias has had a terrible effect on the human system, right? It keeps the fragile fractals so frazzled, right? It's no wonder that no one has any idea what's going on or which way is up, or that no one is learning from the sins of our alleged past, or the duplicity that surrounds them. And so it's our controller's job to keep everyone misdirected and ignorant, right? And they do a very good job of that. One of the things that they use as a tool in this is they keep people from learning from the sins of the past, right? They keep having people make the same mistakes again and again. And how they do this is they promote it, of course, through the media and stuff. And a story broke out over the summer that was the perfect vehicle for this. Right? And it happened in Minnesota. And I love that this story happens in Minnesota because Minnesota has Vikings of its own. And I wonder how long before there's a social justice outcry to change the Minnesota Viking mascot. And it also makes me curious as to how well the Vikings are going to do in this current NFL season. I bet they're going to have a pretty good year. In this year, we had to say goodbye to the Viking. Or who knows, maybe they could have the worst year in franchise history. I know that would be something too. Fun to think about that as well. Now that we have to say goodbye to the Viking. So I love that this is an angle in this story here in Minneapolis. But, so what this story is clearly put out there as a button pusher. It's terrible the way that this story is used to be divisive when it doesn't need to be, right? Because this story isn't about race or skin color at all. Racism isn't about skin color, right?
No, that is incidental.
Racism is about control. And they play the two sides off each other beautifully with this story and its reverse racism angle. You want to talk about stoking some fires, right? No one plays the part of bee's nest poker better than the writer of this article here. Like the white lash behind Minneapolis's plan to fire white teachers explained. And this was published in the Griot, and it was written in its opinion, and it's an opinion piece written by Michael Harriot, and it was published on August 19th, 2022. Right, so the byline here is that while conservative media has characterized the Minneapolis teachers union's agreement as an anti-white civil rights crisis, firing white educators is actually a step towards equity, is his argument here in his opinion piece. And it's his job to let everyone know that firing white teachers is actually a great idea. The problem is that he fails to put this statement into any sort of proper context. And he's really just being antagonistic, throwing heat at the critical thinking abilities of white people. I mean, it's really kind of unbelievable. Because this story, when you think about it critically, isn't about race at all, right? Here's how this story should have been presented, right? And this goes for both sides, right? I mean, there's two sides to this story, but this is how they should have presented it, right? Minneapolis has a ratio problem, right? The Minneapolis public school students, the student body is 37% white, 34% black, and 17% Hispanic, right? But the staff of the Minneapolis public school system is 66% white, we'll call it 18% black, and 6% Hispanic. And this is a big problem, and this disparity here is a big problem in Minneapolis because of how it affects the minority and black students, right? The black and non-white students. It says here, and I love this too. It says that according to almost every study, almost, not every study, almost every study, so there are studies out there that don't support this. You have to think, right? It says that according to almost every study, it says here that black and non-white students have better educational, emotional, and behavioral outcomes in classrooms with same-race teachers. And it's very curious he doesn't choose to talk about the outcomes of white students paired with white teachers, right? That's a very convenient omission because what this policy is its Minneapolis public school systems recognizing the needs of its black and non-white students. This is not about firing white teachers first, right? But they make it about that. It's about restructuring the staff to reflect the needs of its student body, right? There's nothing great about the idea of a qualified person losing their job, regardless of color. So why sell it this way? Why fan these flames? Why say it like this? Why not say hiring more minority teachers is a great idea, or creating more equity in the classroom is a great idea? And he doesn't say it this way because it's his job to keep the fragile fractals agitated, and nothing gets the fragile fractals more agitated than an ism, like racism, right? And that's the thing that gets me about this article, right? The lack of critical thinking the writer displays, especially considering the way he dogs conservatives' critical thinking skills. I mean, this is what I'm talking about here, because he offers up nothing in terms of solutions. Most specifically, where all these new minority teachers are supposed to come from in majority white Minneapolis. Thank you. You know, are they just supposed to import them, right? Because I pulled this from the U.S. Census Bureau, and it says that Minneapolis is 63% white. We'll call it 19% black, and Hispanic is at about 10%. And the author of the article doesn't address this at all. And what do these statistics mean in the face of the demographics of the city? You know, are white people just having fewer children than black people, you know, for this ratio to be so even? Are they shipping their children off to other school districts? You know, why are these percentages the way that they are? Yeah, this is a very interesting part of the story that the author says nothing about, right? Because he wants to lean on these mortifying statistics. That in Minneapolis public schools, black and Hispanic students are more likely to be disciplined and less likely to graduate, with fewer than 1 in 10 passing the state math test and only 1 in 5 reading at grade level. You know, this is the crux of his argument, right? These kids need the same race teachers in order to have a better chance to succeed, right? Because almost every study shows that that's the way it goes. And so he uses this argument to his advantage in his opinion piece. But the problem is that he does not compare these statistics to any black majority school district in the country. Why not? You know, could it be because finding similar results in a black majority school district, you know, one like, say, Baltimore, you know, would destroy his argument? You know, but regardless, this story was given the spin it was given for political purposes, you know, using the identity politics arena, you know, instead of giving it the spin of doing what's right for the children. That's how twisted this game is. And this is just one example of how they keep the fragile fractals from learning from the sins of the past, right? By promoting this, you know, this black and white divide in this story here, instead of focusing on what's best for the children, right? And this brings us to how blind some of the fragile fractals are to the other duplicities that surround them, right? And this also brings us back to the part the Vikings, or the lack thereof, may play in today's political theater, right? Seeing how this guy is only a thing of legend, which they made up, you know, to create these idiots. So the fragile fractals have a common enemy, an enemy so strong that they must be stopped, no matter the cost, right? Because coming this November to a voting booth near you, it's the fall brawl to end them all, right? A battle for the very soul of our nation, according to our esteemed leader, right? And I think it's interesting that in order to have these two avatars face each other, I had to put the right on the left and the left on the right, you know? Another example of duplicity and duality and spellcraft, you know? It's like a mirror image, right? You know, but regardless of all this as well, right? The message coming out of the Democratic Party as they try to hold on to their grips of the House and the Congress is that these are bad people, right? Who are looking to ruin our democracy. Right? And that may be true. You know, I have no idea because I certainly don't follow these idiots. Right? But I do have an understanding that these idiots only make up a very small percentage of these people. And that's conservatives of every race, color, or what have you, right? Because the party is a little more diverse than you may realize, right? And conservative values aren't extreme by nature, right? They're made extreme by idiots, right? But just how dangerous are these idiots if Democratic candidates in 9 states are funding the campaigns of MAGA and other far-right candidates to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, amplifying far-right candidates? You know, this is really unbelievable. You know, so what they're doing is these Democratic candidates is they're buying advertising, you know, TV spots, print ads, posters for these MAGA and other far-right candidates in the hopes that they, the MAGA candidates, will win their primaries over more moderate and less extreme Republican candidates. Because the Democrats believe MAGA candidates are going to be easier to beat come election time, right? And this should tell you all you need to know about just how dangerous, you know, the far-right agenda truly is, or at least how dangerous the Democratic Party wants you to think it is. if they're willing to spend all this money propping up paper tigers and calling them saber-tooths, well, this is as disingenuous as it gets, right? The Democrats are rigging elections with this strategy, and they're trying to anyway, and this is hypocrisy at its finest. If this stuff is happening in elections, if I'm a conservative out there, I'm starting to question whether or not any of the information I'm seeing in the web pages that I'm reading or the videos or the channels that I'm watching aren't bought paid for by the opposition. This is how deep the game goes. You can't trust anyone out there, it's all psyops. It's absolutely ridiculous, if you want to string it out that way. So if these MAGA candidates are the threat to democracy that the Democrats are saying they are, then the only way the Democrats can preserve democracy is to pervert democracy. How's that for some pretzel logic, right? And is there a more capitalist approach to elections than this? Oh, the irony. But, it's okay for the Democrats to do this because the end justifies the means, Certainly they'd be crying foul if this were happening on the other side. And God, I hope it is. I absolutely hope that Republicans are, turnabout is fair play, right? Hopefully they're engaging in this type of activity as well. But what this practice tells me is that the Democrats must be deathly afraid of the moderate, non-extreme tenets of modern conservatism, if they're only propping up the extremists, right? Because they want you to confuse all conservatives with these idiots. They want you to think of these idiots when you think of these people. And this is a part of the narrative that they've been working on for a long time. And that's what the Norse code is going to be all about, exploring that. Not so much the history of the Vikings as the narrative tells us, or too many grand theories about, who the Vikings may have been, because obviously if they're a part of our history, there's something false about them. But they played the role that was created for them perfectly. And so now I want to know more, right? Who's responsible for these Vikings and all the shenanigans? And so I hope to get into that and a whole lot more in the next boundary smashing episode, right? So remember, guys, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. Cheers.